Rain fell over Manhattan in thin silver needles, blurring the lights of the Upper East Side into smeared gold. Inside Maplewood Kindergarten, the world was warmer. Crayon-coloured walls, the smell of apple juice and glue sticks, the soft murmur of 5-year-olds arguing over whose turn it was to feed the class goldfish. Claire Bennett knelt by the reading corner, a picture book open on her lap, and watched the little girl in the pale blue cardigan sit exactly 3 feet away from the rest of the circle. Sofia Marchetti, 6 years old. Dark curls, enormous brown eyes, a face that belonged on the cover of a porcelain doll catalogue, and a silence so complete it had become the subject of hushed conversation in the teacher's lounge. "She hasn't said a word since September, Mrs." Alvarez, the school director, had told Claire on her first day. Not to the counsellor, not to her father, not to anyone. The last teacher gave up in October. Claire hadn't given up. She never gave up on a child who was hurting. It wasn't in her nature. She'd learned in 6 years of teaching that silence was rarely stubbornness. It was armour. "Sofia," Claire said gently, turning the book so the girl could see the illustration. A fox curled beneath a willow tree. "Do you think the fox is lonely, or do you think he likes being alone?" Sofia's eyes flicked to the page. Just a flicker. Then back to her lap, where her small hands were folded like she was praying or bracing. Claire didn't push. She simply kept reading aloud, her voice low and warm, letting the words fill the space Sofia wasn't ready to fill herself. By the time the bell rang for pickup, Sofia had scooted 4 inches closer to the book. It wasn't nothing. In this line of work, 4 inches was everything. The other children spilled toward the door, where parents waited in a loose, cheerful crowd. Mothers in yoga pants, a grandmother with an umbrella patterned like ladybugs, a nanny scrolling her phone. Claire helped a boy find his missing mitten, tied a girl's shoelace, and was reaching for Sofia's little backpack when the front door opened and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. He walked in like weather. That was the only way Claire could describe it later, like the room had been sunny, and now a shadow had crossed the sun. Tall black wool coat, dark hair combed back with severe precision, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than born. He didn't smile at the other parents. He didn't seem to see them at all. His eyes went straight to Sofia, and something in his face, something Claire almost missed because it passed so quickly, softened for exactly 1 second before the mask slid back into place. "Sofia." His voice was low, controlled, faintly accented in a way Claire couldn't place. Not quite Italian, not quite American, something forged between 2 worlds. "Andiamo, piccola." Sofia stood without a word and walked to him, slipping her small hand into his. He crouched, an odd sight, a man built like a fortress folding himself down to a child's height, and adjusted the collar of her cardigan with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about him. Then his eyes lifted to Claire, and she felt them land on her like a physical weight. "You're the new teacher," he said, not a question. "Claire Bennett." She extended her hand out of habit, before remembering that most parents didn't shake hands with her, they just nodded and left. He looked at her hand for a beat too long, as if deciding something, and then took it. His grip was warm, dry, controlled, the handshake of a man who had learned long ago never to squeeze harder than necessary, because he could. "Damien Marchetti," he said, "Sofia's father." "She had a good day," Claire said, because it was mostly true, and because she'd learned that parents of silent children needed to hear something good more than they needed the truth of how hard the day had actually been. She sat closer to the group during story time. Something flickered behind his dark eyes, surprise maybe, or hope trying to break through concrete. "Closer," he repeated softly, almost to himself. 4 inches, Claire said, and immediately regretted how strange it sounded aloud. But Damien Marchetti didn't look at her like it was strange. He looked at her the way a starving man looks at the first plate of food in days. 4 inches is not nothing, he said quietly, and Claire's breath caught, because it was almost word for word what she'd thought an hour before. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He held her gaze a moment longer than the interaction required. Then, as if catching himself, he straightened, took Sofia's backpack from Claire's hands, his fingers brushing hers, warm and deliberate, and said, "Thank you, Miss Bennett," in a tone that made her name sound like it belonged to him now, filed away somewhere for later use. He turned and walked out into the rain, with his daughter's hand in his, the black car waiting at the curb, a driver in a dark suit already holding the door. Claire watched through the window as Sofia climbed in, small and swallowed by the leather seat, and Damien paused before following her. Just a half-second pause, his head turning back toward the school, toward the window, toward her. Then the door shut, and the car pulled away into the rain. And Claire stood there, with her hand still faintly warm from his, wondering why her heart was beating like she'd just stepped too close to the edge of something very high. She didn't know his name yet. Not his real name. Not what New York's underworld whispered when men like Damien Marchetti walked into a room. She only knew that he'd looked at his daughter like she was the last good thing in a burning world, and that he'd looked at Claire for one unguarded second like she might be the second. By the second week of October, 4 inches had become 11. Claire kept count the way a scientist keeps count of a fragile experiment, marking each small victory in the margins of her lesson planner. Sofia sat next to Emma during snack. Sofia touched the paintbrush. Sofia looked at me and didn't look away. She hadn't spoken, not once, but something in her had begun to thaw degree by degree, and Claire had the strange, humbling sense that she was watching a frozen lake begin to crack. Not from the top, where the ice was thickest, but from somewhere underneath, some warm current no one else could see. Damien Marchetti came for pickup every day at exactly 3:15. Never early, never late. Claire noticed things about him the way she noticed things about Sofia, small, cumulative data points that built into a picture she didn't fully trust herself to interpret. He wore a different suit every day, always dark, always flawless, like armor, tailored by someone who understood that a man's clothes could be a warning. He carried himself like every room he entered had already been assessed for exits. And every single day, without fail, he asked the same question in the same low voice. How was she today? Not did she talk, not is she better, just how was she? As if the answer belonged to Sofia entirely, and Claire's only job was to relay it faithfully, like a translator standing at the border of a country he wasn't allowed to enter. She laughed today, Claire told him on a grey Thursday, and watched his whole body go still. Laughed, he repeated, the word catching in his throat like a bone. At recess, another girl fell into a puddle, completely fine, just muddy, and Sofia laughed. It was quiet, but it was real. Damien Marchetti, feared by men whose names made headlines in whispers, closed his eyes for one long moment in the middle of a kindergarten hallway decorated with paper pumpkins, and when he opened them again, they were wet. "She hasn't laughed," he said, "since her mother died." The words landed in Claire's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She hadn't asked. She made a policy of not asking parents about tragedies unless they offered, but now the ripples of it explained everything. The silence, the careful watching, the way this man, dangerous in ways she couldn't name but sensed instinctively, handled his daughter like she was made of spun glass. "I'm so sorry," Claire said, and meant it with her whole chest. 2 years, he said, staring at some middle distance past Claire's shoulder. 2 years, and she has not said one word since the funeral. Doctors, specialists. I have paid for the best minds in this country to sit across from my daughter and get nothing. Silence. His jaw tightened, and you get 4 inches and a laugh. "It's not a competition," Claire said softly. "Grief doesn't work on anyone's timeline but hers." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had on that first rainy day, and something in his cold, composed face cracked open, just slightly, just enough for Claire to see the exhausted, grieving father underneath the tailored coat and the careful voice. "You are the first thing," he said, "that has made her want to open her eyes in the morning. Do you understand what that means to me?" Claire's throat tightened. "I understand that it means a great deal." "It means everything," he said, and the word everything came out rough, almost broken, before he composed himself again, buttoning his coat like he was buttoning himself back into the armor. "I would like—" He paused, choosing words with visible care, a man unused to asking for anything. "To speak with you further. Not here. Somewhere I can properly thank you. Dinner, perhaps." Claire's pulse jumped. It wasn't appropriate, was it? A parent asking a teacher to dinner? And yet something about the way he said it wasn't smooth or practiced like a line. It was raw, uncertain. A man who did not know how to ask for things, because in his world, things were simply taken or given, never requested. "I don't usually—" she started. "I know," he said quickly. "It is inappropriate. I am aware. I do not typically—" He stopped, exhaled, and for the first time she saw him look almost boyish, almost lost. "Forgive me. It has been a long time since I wanted to ask a woman anything." The honesty of it disarmed her more than any polished invitation could have. "It would have to be just as her teacher," Claire said carefully, "not anything else." Something moved behind his eyes, dark and patient, like a predator content to wait. "Of course," he said, "just dinner. Just gratitude." She should have said no. Later, lying awake in her small apartment in Astoria, with the radiator ticking and rain against the window, she would replay the moment and understand exactly why she hadn't. It wasn't his money. She could tell from the car, the coat, the watch, that he had more of it than she'd see in a lifetime, and money had never moved her. It wasn't even his face, though it was a face that belonged in oil paintings of fallen angels. It was the way he'd said, "She has not said one word since the funeral." And then, in the very same breath, "You are the first thing that has made her want to open her eyes in the morning." It was the way grief and hope lived in him at the same time, tangled together like roots, and how he'd looked at Claire as if she were the only person in New York who understood both. "Friday," she heard herself say, "after she's asleep, somewhere quiet." Damien Marchetti's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, a man remembering how the expression worked. "Friday," he agreed, and something in the word sounded like a vow. The restaurant had no sign. Claire almost walked past it twice before the driver, the same quiet man in the dark suit, gently redirected her toward an unmarked door on a side street off Fifth Avenue, where a host, who clearly recognized the car more than her face, ushered her inside without a word. Inside, it was hushed and golden, all dark wood and candlelight, tables spaced so far apart that conversations couldn't drift between them. Only a handful of diners occupied the room, all of them dressed like they'd stepped out of magazines Claire had never been able to afford. A woman in red silk laughed low and private in a corner booth. Two older men in impeccable suits spoke over glasses of amber liquor, and Claire noticed, she couldn't help but notice, that when Damien walked in behind her, both men's conversation stopped entirely, their eyes tracking him with something that looked almost like fear, dressed up as respect. He didn't seem to notice, or he was simply so used to it, that it registered the way weather registers to someone who has always lived outdoors. "Miss Bennett." He held her chair before she could reach for it herself, an old-world gesture that felt both foreign and, disconcertingly, natural. "Thank you for coming." "Claire," she said, "if we're doing dinner, you should probably use my first name." "Claire," he repeated, testing the shape of it, and something about the way he said it, slow, deliberate, like he was committing it to memory, made warmth crawl up the back of her neck. They ordered. He ordered for both of them, in fact, in fluent Italian, to a waiter who nodded and vanished, and then seemed to catch himself. "Forgive me, old habit. Please, if you wanted something else." "It's fine," Claire said, and meant it, because she was too busy studying him across the candlelight to care what arrived on the plate. Up close, without the school hallway's fluorescent lights, he looked younger than she'd assumed, maybe mid-30s, and more tired. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes that even his composure couldn't hide. "Can I ask you something?" she said, because the question had been sitting in her chest since Thursday. "You may ask me anything," he said. "I do not promise to answer." Fair enough. "What happened to Sofia's mother?" His hand, resting on the white tablecloth, curled slightly. Not a fist, just a tightening, the body's memory of pain, older than words. "Isabella," he said, "my wife. She died 2 years ago. An accident." The pause before the word was so brief most people would have missed it. Claire didn't. Sofia was with her. She saw everything. Claire's chest ached. That explains so much. The doctors say it is a form of selective mutism triggered by trauma. Her mind protects itself by refusing to give voice to what she witnessed. He said the clinical words carefully, like reciting something memorized from too many appointments, too many sterile offices. They say time may help. They say many things. None of it has helped as much as 4 inches and a laugh at a puddle. "I'm not a miracle worker," Claire said gently. "I just give her room to come back at her own pace. That's all any of us can do." "You underestimate yourself," Damien said, and his voice dropped into something lower, more private. "I have watched men far larger and far more frightening than you fail to move my daughter 1 inch. And you have moved her, gently, without her even noticing she was moving. That is not nothing, Claire. That is a gift." The way he said her name settled somewhere warm and low in her stomach, and she had to look down at her wineglass to keep from blushing like a schoolgirl, an irony not lost on her, given her profession. "Tell me about you," he said. "Not Sofia's teacher. You." So she told him. About growing up in Ohio, the daughter of a nurse and a high school football coach, the scholarship that brought her to New York, the small apartment in Astoria with the loud upstairs neighbour and the good light in the mornings. She told him about why she'd become a teacher, a kindergarten teacher of her own, Mrs. Patterson, who had made a shy, stammering 7-year-old Claire feel like the smartest person in the room. She told him she liked jazz on Sunday mornings and hated cilantro and had never, not once, been to Europe. He listened like her words were the only sound in the world. He didn't check his phone, didn't glance at the door, didn't do any of the distracted half-listening she'd grown used to on the rare dates she'd been on in the last few years. He listened like a man storing up provisions against a long winter. "And you?" she asked finally. "Tell me about you, Damien Marchetti. What do you do that lets you pick your daughter up at 3:15 every single day in a suit that costs more than my rent?" Something shifted behind his eyes, a shutter closing, quick and practiced. "Real estate," he said smoothly. "Investments, import and export." The answer was true in the way a coat of paint is true, covering something without lying about its colour. "It is not interesting. I would rather hear you laugh again. You laughed before when you talked about your neighbour's cat." She let him redirect her, though some small, quiet part of her filed the deflection away, the way she filed away Sofia's 4 inches, a data point, noted, not yet understood. By the time the car dropped her back at her apartment in Astoria near midnight, the rain had started again, and Damien walked her to the door beneath a black umbrella he produced as if from nowhere, his hand hovering at the small of her back without quite touching. "Thank you for tonight," he said at her door, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the space between them charged like the air before lightning. "Thank you for asking," she said. He lifted her hand, the same hand he'd shaken weeks ago in a rain-streaked hallway, and pressed his lips to her knuckles, brief and formal, and somehow devastating. "Good night, Claire," he murmured against her skin. And then he was gone, folding himself back into the black car, and she stood on her stoop in the rain for a full minute after the tail-lights disappeared, trying to remember how to breathe normally. Autumn deepened, and with it came a quiet rhythm that Claire hadn't anticipated, but found herself, against every professional instinct, cherishing. Damien began arriving at 3 o'clock instead of 3:15, which meant 15 extra minutes standing in the coat closet doorway of Maplewood Kindergarten, watching Sofia finish her afternoon activities, talking to Claire in low voices about nothing important, the weather, a book Sofia liked, whether 6-year-olds should be allowed unlimited glitter privileges. Claire's professional opinion, absolutely not. Damien's opinion, delivered with the driest, almost smile she'd yet seen. She is his daughter. Glitter is the least of his problems. He brought coffee sometimes, always exactly right, oat milk, 1 sugar, though she'd only mentioned her order once, weeks ago, in passing. He remembered everything. It should have unsettled her, a man who filed away details with such precision, but instead it felt like being truly seen for the first time in years. "You don't have to keep buying me coffee," she told him one Tuesday, though she took the cup anyway, warming her cold hands around it. "I don't have to do many things," he said. "I do them because I want to." There was a weight beneath his words that Claire couldn't quite name. Not arrogance exactly, but the certainty of a man who had learned, at some point in his life, that wanting something and having it were the same action, collapsed into one motion. It should have frightened her. Instead, watching him crouch to fix Sofia's mitten with the same absolute care he'd shown pouring milk into her coffee, it made something in Claire's chest ache with a tenderness she hadn't expected. Sofia, for her part, had begun to change in ways that made the entire staff of Maplewood whisper in the break room. She drew pictures now. Always 3 figures. Always the same 3. A tall, dark-haired man, a small girl in a blue dress, and, more recently, a woman with yellow hair holding both of their hands. Claire had found the drawing tucked into Sofia's cubby one Wednesday and had to excuse herself to the supply closet to cry for exactly 90 seconds before pulling herself back together. She didn't tell Damien about the drawing. Some things, she thought, a child should be allowed to keep private, even from the people who loved her most. But she did tell him, one bitterly cold Friday in November, about the moment Sofia had almost spoken. "We were doing show and tell," Claire said, watching his whole body lean toward her like a plant toward light. She brought a photograph. I think it was her mother, though she didn't say. She held it up to the class, and her mouth opened, and for just a second, Damien, I really thought, what happened? His voice was rough. Nothing came out, but her lips moved. She was trying to form a word. I could see it. He was silent for a long moment, staring past her at nothing, his jaw working. "What word do you think it was?" "I don't know," Claire admitted. "But I think it was close, Damien. I think she's close." He reached out then, not for her hand, not quite, but close enough that his fingers brushed the sleeve of her cardigan, a touch so light it might have been accidental, except that nothing about this man was accidental. "Because of you," he said quietly. "All of it. Because of you." "Because of her," Claire corrected gently. "I'm just holding the door open. She's the one deciding to walk through it." "You are too humble," he murmured. "It is one of the things I—" He stopped himself, and Claire watched him visibly rebuild the wall he'd almost let slip, brick by brick, in real time. "It is admirable," he finished instead, though they both knew that wasn't the sentence he'd started. She didn't push. She'd learned, watching him with Sofia, that some things needed to be allowed to come at their own pace too. That weekend, for the first time, he invited her somewhere that wasn't dinner and wasn't the school hallway. Sofia's ballet recital, A small, informal thing at a dance studio on the Upper West Side, 12 6-year-olds in tutus attempting, with varying degrees of success, to remember which foot was which. "You don't have to come," he told her over the phone, his voice carrying an uncertainty that felt foreign on him, like a coat that didn't fit. "I only thought she would want you there, and I—" A pause, waited. "I would want you there." Claire went. She sat beside him in a folding chair too small for adult bodies, watching Sofia stumble through a routine with fierce, silent concentration. And when the girl found her father's face in the crowd afterward, she didn't run to him first. She ran to Claire. Small arms wrapped around Claire's waist, a face pressed into her stomach, and Claire's whole chest cracked open with something too big for the room to hold. She knelt down, wrapped her arms around the girl, and over Sofia's dark curls she met Damien's eyes. He wasn't guarding anything in that moment. His face was raw, open, undone. A man watching the two most important people in his fractured world hold on to each other like the answer to a prayer he hadn't dared to say aloud. "Claire," he said later, after Sofia had fallen asleep in the back of the car, her head on Claire's shoulder, "I need to tell you something." "Okay," Claire said, still stroking Sofia's hair, her heart still too full to properly brace for whatever was coming. "I'm falling in love with you," he said, quiet and certain, like a man confessing to a crime he had no intention of stopping. "I did not intend for this. I do not know how to do this carefully. But I wanted you to know before this goes any further, because you deserve honesty, even if it is inconvenient." Claire's breath caught somewhere between her ribs. "Damien, you don't have to answer tonight," he said quickly, and for the first time since she'd met him, Damien Marchetti, a man who moved through the world like nothing could touch him, looked afraid. "I only needed you to know." Outside the window, the city blurred past in streaks of gold and red, and Claire, with a sleeping child's weight warm against her side and a dangerous, devastating man watching her like she held his whole future in her hands, said the only true thing she had. "I think I already knew." Claire told herself in the days that followed that this was simply what falling for someone felt like. The dizziness, the constant awareness of her phone, the way she caught herself smiling at nothing while grading finger painting projects. She told herself the strange things, the things that didn't quite fit, were nothing. The black car that idled outside her apartment sometimes, even on nights Damien wasn't there, driven by a man she didn't recognize, doing nothing but watching the street. "Security," Damien had said when she'd mentioned it, his tone closing the subject before it opened. "A man in my position has enemies. It is nothing you should worry about." The way certain restaurant staff went pale when he entered, hands trembling slightly as they set down water glasses. The way the two older men in suits from that first dinner had appeared again, weeks later, at another restaurant, and one of them had actually stood when Damien walked past. A strange, formal half-bow that no ordinary businessman would command. The scar on his forearm, thin and old, that he'd covered quickly with his sleeve when she'd asked about it, saying only, "A disagreement, long ago," in a tone that closed doors faster than any wall. Claire noticed these things the way she noticed everything, carefully, quietly. And each time she chose not to ask. Partly because she was afraid of the answer, partly because Sofia was speaking now, in fragments, in whispered half-words to Claire alone during quiet reading time, and Claire could not bear to disrupt the fragile ecosystem of healing that had bloomed around this strange, careful family for something as small as her own curiosity. But curiosity, unattended, becomes something else. It becomes a splinter. "Have you heard of Marchetti Holdings?" her friend Priya asked one Sunday over brunch, scrolling her phone with the particular energy of someone who'd stumbled onto gossip. "There's an article about some big real estate deal downtown, some tower on the west side. Your guy's company name is all over it." "He's not," Claire started, then stopped, because 6 weeks in, "not my guy" wasn't quite true anymore. "What does it say?" Priya turned the phone around. The article was mostly financial jargon, zoning permits and shell companies and joint ventures. But one line caught Claire's eye like a hook in soft skin. Marchetti Holdings, whose ownership structure remains notoriously opaque despite decades of federal scrutiny. "Federal scrutiny," Claire repeated slowly. "Probably just tax stuff," Priya said, already scrolling past it, uninterested. "Rich people are always getting investigated for something." Claire nodded, but the phrase stuck to her like a burr, and that night, alone in her apartment, with a glass of wine she didn't finish, she did something she'd never done before. She typed his name into a search bar. Damien Marchetti. The first several results were exactly what she expected. A Foundation Gala photo from 3 years ago, Damien in a tuxedo beside a laughing, dark-haired woman Claire recognised instantly as Isabella from Sofia's drawings, both of them radiant and young and untouched by grief. A charity donation announcement, a brief mention in a real estate trade publication. But further down, buried on the second page of results, was an old news article, 5 years old, grainy and half-buried by SEO-optimized noise. Federal investigators probe alleged ties between Marchetti family and organized crime network. No charges, no convictions. Just innuendo dressed up as journalism. The kind of piece that got written about powerful men, whether or not anything was true. Claire closed the laptop. She told herself it meant nothing. Rich men attracted rumours the way honey attracted flies. It was the price of visibility, not evidence of guilt. She told herself this for 3 days, through pick-up and drop-off, and a phone call where Damien's voice, warm and low, asked about her weekend and made her forget, briefly, that she'd ever typed his name into a search bar at all. But on Thursday, something happened that made the splinter dig deeper. She'd stayed late grading papers, and the school was mostly empty, the halls dim with only the emergency lighting on, when she heard voices in the parking lot, low, urgent, unmistakably Damien's, though colder than she'd ever heard it, stripped of every gentleness he'd shown her. She shouldn't have looked, she told herself that later, 100 times, but the window of the empty classroom looked out over the lot, and she saw him standing beside the black car, another man in front of him, younger, sweating despite the cold, his hands raised in some gesture of pleading. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw Damien's face, the mask of gentle warmth completely gone, replaced by something so absolute, so terrifyingly calm, that her blood went cold just watching it from 30 feet and a pane of glass away. She saw him say something short, 3 or 4 words, and watched the younger man's face crumple into something close to terror. She saw the driver, the same quiet man who'd held umbrellas for her, opened doors for her, remembered her coffee order, step forward and take the younger man by the arm, guiding him, not gently, into the back of a second car. Then Damien straightened his coat,
smoothed his expression back into the man she knew, and walked toward the school entrance to collect his daughter, as if nothing at all had happened. Claire stood frozen in the dark classroom for a long, long moment, her heart hammering, understanding with the sick, dropping certainty of a woman who has just glimpsed the true shape of something she'd been standing beside for weeks, that Damien Marchetti was not simply a grieving father with a talent for real estate. He was something else entirely, and she had no idea yet how far down the darkness went. She didn't confront him that night. She told herself it was because Sofia was there, tugging at Claire's sleeve with the particular urgency of a child who wanted a specific book read a specific way, and it would have been cruel to let whatever storm was building in Claire's chest spill over into the one place that was supposed to be safe for a healing little girl. But the truth, if she was honest with herself, in the dark of her own apartment that night, was that she was afraid. Not of him, exactly, not in that moment. Afraid of what she might learn. Afraid that once certain words were spoken aloud, she could never again unhear them. She lasted 4 days. On Monday, after Sofia had fallen asleep on the living room couch of Damien's Fifth Avenue penthouse, an apartment so vast and cold and beautiful it looked less like a home and more like a museum exhibit of what wealth was supposed to look like, Claire sat across from him in the kitchen, a cup of tea going lukewarm in her hands, and made herself ask, "Damien, what do you actually do?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her over the rim of his own glass, something unreadable moving behind his dark eyes. "You've been asking around," he said, not accusing, just observing, the way he observed everything, cataloguing. "I saw something," Claire said, "Thursday night, in the parking lot." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I see." "There was a man. He looked terrified of you, Damien. And your driver. He put him in a car like he was being taken somewhere against his will. And I looked you up, and there were articles, old ones, about federal investigations, about—" She made herself say the word, because not saying it felt like a kind of cowardice. "Organized crime." The silence stretched long enough that Claire's tea went fully cold in her hands. "Come with me," Damien said finally, and rose, offering his hand. He led her to the study, a room she hadn't been in before, all dark wood shelves and a fireplace that crackled low and steady, and closed the door behind them with a soft, final click. "I'm going to tell you the truth," he said, standing very still in the firelight, "because I respect you too much to keep lying to you, and because I think you deserve to make your choices with open eyes. But I need you to understand, Claire, that once I tell you this, there is no going back to not knowing." Claire's heart pounded. "Tell me." "My family," Damien said slowly, each word placed like a stone in a wall, "has run organized business in this city for 3 generations. My grandfather, my father, now me. We are not," a humorless breath, almost a laugh, "we are not what films make us. There is no singing, no dramatic speeches. There is only business, and the business is not always clean." He met her eyes without flinching. "I control interests across shipping, real estate, several arrangements that the federal government would very much like to prosecute if they could ever find sufficient evidence. The man you saw Thursday owed money to people under my authority. He was not harmed. He was reminded of his obligations. Claire's mouth had gone dry. "The Mafia," she said, because someone had to say the actual words. "You're telling me you run the Mafia?" "I am telling you," Damien said, "that I am the most powerful man in a world you did not know existed until 4 days ago, and that I have spent every day since I met you terrified that this exact conversation would end everything before it had the chance to become what I want it to become." "And Isabella?" Claire's voice cracked on the name. "How did she really die?" Something in Damien's face shattered, just slightly, the composure fracturing like ice under pressure. "A rival family," he said, quiet and terrible. "A message meant for me, delivered to my wife instead, while my daughter sat in the back seat and watched it happen." "That is the world I live in, Claire. That is what I have spent 2 years trying to keep Sofia far away from, and what I have tried, God knows I have tried, to keep you far away from as well." The fire popped in the silence. Claire stood very still, her mind reeling through 6 weeks of memories now recontextualized in a single devastating light. The security cars, the men who trembled, the restaurant where powerful men rose slightly from their seats, the scar he wouldn't explain. All of it slotting into place like puzzle pieces, revealing a picture far darker than she'd ever imagined. "You should have told me," she said finally, her voice unsteady. "Weeks ago. Before you what?" His voice was rough now, urgent, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. "Before you fell in love with me, Claire. Because I think it's too late for that already, and I think you know it too." "That's not fair." "None of this is fair," he said. And for the first time, she heard real desperation in his voice, a crack in the fortress. "It was never fair that Isabella died. It was never fair that my daughter stopped speaking. It is not fair that I am asking you to love a man whose hands are not clean, in a world that will hurt you the moment it learns your name. I know this. I have known this every single day since that first rainy afternoon when you knelt on the floor with my silent daughter and made her want to live again." Claire's eyes burned. "Then why did you let this happen? Why did you let me fall for you, if you knew it would end in a moment exactly like this one?" Damien reached for her hands, and she let him take them, because some part of her, the part that had watched him crouch to fix a mitten, the part that had heard him confess love in the back of a car with his sleeping daughter between them, could not make herself pull away. "Because I am selfish," he said quietly. "Because for 2 years I have been a dead man walking through a beautiful apartment, going through the motions of raising a child who would not speak to me. And then you walked into that classroom, and for the first time since Isabella died, I wanted something. I wanted you. And I told myself I would find a way to keep you safe from all of it, even if it meant lying by omission for as long as I possibly could." Claire pulled her hands free, not in anger, but because she needed the space to think, to breathe, to feel her own feet under her again. "I need time," she whispered. "I need to think about what this means. For me, for Sofia, for all of it." Damien nodded, jaw tight, eyes glassy with a grief that had nothing to do with Isabella and everything to do with the very real possibility of losing something else he loved. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I will not chase you. I will not send men to your door. I will not call 100 times. I only ask," his voice broke slightly, "that you remember
Whatever you decide, that everything I have shown you these 6 weeks was true. The man who loves you is real, even if the world around him is not what you believed. Claire walked out of that penthouse alone that night, into a cold November wind, and did not look back, though every part of her wanted to. She didn't answer his calls for 11 days. It wasn't cruelty. She told herself that on the bad nights, when her thumb hovered over his contact name at 2 in the morning. It was survival. She needed to know if what she felt for Damien Marchetti could exist in the same body as the fear now living beneath her ribs. The fear that had crystallized the moment he'd said the word Mafia out loud in his own study, in his own low, steady voice, like a man confessing to something he was neither proud of nor able to change. At school, she still saw Sofia every day, and that was its own particular agony, because Sofia, it turned out, had noticed. Children always noticed. On the 3rd day of Claire's silence toward Damien, Sofia had tugged at her sleeve during quiet time, and in a whispered fragment of a voice so soft Claire almost missed it, said the first full sentence anyone had heard from her in 2 years. "Is Papa sad?" Claire's whole body had gone electric with shock. She'd knelt immediately, taking both of Sofia's small hands. "Sofia, you spoke." The girl's eyes had gone wide, as if she too was surprised by her own voice, and then, terrified she might have made a mistake, she'd clamped her mouth shut again, retreating back into silence like a turtle into its shell. But it had happened. 3 words. "Is Papa sad?" And Claire had spent that entire night lying awake, staring at her ceiling, turning the question over and over. Because the honest answer was, "Yes, Sofia, your father is sad, and I think I am the reason, and I don't know what to do about any of it." She called Damien the next morning. "She spoke," Claire said, before he could say anything else, her voice tight with emotion. "Yesterday. She asked if you were sad." There was a long silence on the line, and when Damien spoke again, his voice was thick. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you loved her very much, and that grown-ups sometimes have complicated feelings that aren't her job to fix." Claire closed her eyes. "Damien, I've been thinking about everything. I have not stopped thinking about you for one single moment," he said quietly. "Whatever you have decided, I would rather hear it than continue wondering." "I haven't decided anything," Claire admitted. "I keep going back and forth. I think about you, and I think about how you looked at Sofia's mitten like the whole world depended on it being fixed correctly, and I think, how can that man also be the man who does the things you told me about? And then I think about Isabella, about how she died because of who you are. And I'm terrified, Damien. I'm terrified of loving you and ending up the same way. I would burn down every family in this city," Damien said, low and fierce, "before I let anything touch you. I have made mistakes. I have inherited a war I did not start and cannot simply walk away from. Believe me, I have tried. For Sofia's sake, I have tried for 2 years to extract myself from parts of this life. But I promise you this, Claire. I would spend every resource I have, every man loyal to me, every dollar in every account to keep you safe. That is not a small promise. In my world, it is the largest one I know how to make." Claire's chest ached with the terrible, dizzying pull of wanting to believe him completely. "I need to see you," she said finally. "Not the penthouse, somewhere neutral. I need to look at you and decide if I can do this with my eyes open." He agreed instantly, and they met 2 days later at a small park bench in Riverside overlooking the Hudson, both of them wrapped against the cold, a respectful foot of space between them that neither dared to close. "Tell me everything," Claire said. "Not the sanitized version. Everything. I need to know what I'm choosing, if I choose it." So he told her. He told her about his father, a man who had ruled with fear and taught his son that love was a weakness to be hidden, never indulged. He told her about the men beneath him, hundreds of them, loyal through decades of blood and money and mutual protection, and the delicate balance of power between 5 families that kept an uneasy, brutal peace across the city. He told her about the parts of the business that were legitimate, the real estate, the shipping, and the parts that were not, though he was careful, she noticed, never to give her details that could implicate her simply by knowing them. "And Isabella's death," Claire said, "was it ever resolved?" Damien's face went hard in a way she recognized now, the mask she'd seen in the parking lot. "The men responsible are no longer a concern," he said, in a tone that closed the subject as thoroughly as a door slamming shut. And Claire understood, with a chill that ran the length of her spine, exactly what that sentence meant, and chose, for her own peace of mind, not to ask further. "I'm not naive," she said quietly, after a long silence. "I know what I'd be choosing. I know the danger doesn't go away just because I love you anyway." "No," Damien agreed, "it does not." "But I keep thinking about the drawing Sofia made," Claire continued. 3 figures, you, her, and a woman with yellow hair holding both your hands. She drew that before you ever told me the truth, Damien, before I knew any of this. She saw something in the 3 of us that I think I've been too scared to admit I saw too." Damien turned to face her fully then, his dark eyes bright with something raw and hopeful. A man who had spent 2 years believing joy was a country he'd been permanently exiled from. "Claire," he said, "I am not asking you to save me. I am past saving, in many ways, and I have made peace with the things I have done to survive in this world. But Sofia is not past saving, and I hope, that neither am I entirely, not if you are standing beside me while I try." Claire reached across the small distance between them and took his hand, the same hand that had shaken hers in a rainy hallway weeks ago, the same hand that had smoothed his daughter's collar with impossible gentleness, the same hand that she now understood carried more weight and more blood than she could fully comprehend. "I'm choosing you," she said, her voice shaking but certain. "Both of you, with my eyes open." Damien Marchetti, feared by men who ran empires, closed his eyes at her words like a man finally allowed to set down a weight he'd carried alone for far too long. And when he opened them again, there were tears on his face that he did not bother to hide. Winter arrived in earnest, and with it came a new chapter of careful, deliberate intimacy between them, one built now on honesty instead of omission, which changed everything and nothing all at once. Claire still taught kindergarten. She still went home to her small apartment in Astoria most nights, still graded papers at her kitchen table, still argued with her upstairs neighbour about the volume of his television. But now, several evenings a week, a car collected her after Sofia had gone to sleep, and brought her to the penthouse, where Damien waited with the particular hunger of a man who had spent 2 years believing he would never again have someone to wait for. He courted her the old way. She recognized it, even though she'd never experienced it before, this deliberate, almost formal pacing that felt lifted from another century. He sent flowers to the school, addressed to Ms. Bennett, never anything more presumptuous, though the arrangements grew steadily more extravagant until Mrs. Alvarez had begun making pointed comments about certain parents during staff meetings. He remembered every detail of every conversation, weaponizing his attention the way other men weaponized charm, a rare edition of a book she'd mentioned once appearing on her desk. A specific brand of tea from a shop in Chinatown she'd complained she could never find uptown, delivered in a paper bag with no note, because he'd learned, correctly, that she didn't need the gesture explained. "You're spoiling me," she told him one December evening, curled into the corner of his enormous leather sofa, a fire crackling in the hearth, while Sofia slept down the hall. "I am trying," Damien said, sitting close enough that his arm rested along the back of the sofa behind her, not quite touching, "to make up for lost time. I do not know how many years I have left to spoil you in this life. I intend to use them well." The words carried a weight beneath their romance, an acknowledgement, quiet and constant, that the danger surrounding him was not hypothetical, not a plot device in a story, but a real and present possibility that could end everything at any moment. Claire had learned to live alongside that knowledge, the way people learn to live near fault lines, aware, careful, but unwilling to abandon a beautiful place simply because the ground occasionally shook. Their first kiss happened in early December, in the kitchen of all unglamorous places, while Damien attempted, badly, to help Sofia's tutor teach the girl to make hot chocolate, flour and cocoa powder dusting the marble counters like snow. Sofia had laughed, actually laughed, a real bright sound that made both adults freeze in place, staring at the miracle of it. And in the swell of pure joy that followed, Damien had turned to Claire, his eyes bright with unshed emotion, and kissed her. It wasn't practiced or performative. It was clumsy with feeling, his hand cupping her jaw like she might dissolve if he held her any less carefully. And when they broke apart, Sofia was watching them with wide eyes and something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Does this mean," Sofia whispered, her third full sentence in 2 years, delivered so quietly it took Claire a full second to process it, "you're going to stay?" Claire knelt immediately, tears already spilling. "Would you like me to stay, Sofia?" The girl nodded, once, decisively, and then, in a gesture that undid Claire completely, reached out and took both Claire's hand and her father's hand and pressed them together between her small palms, as if sealing something, as if she'd been waiting for this exact configuration of family for 2 long years of silence. Damien made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and gathered them both, Claire and Sofia, into his arms, right there in the flour-dusted kitchen, and for one perfect, suspended moment, the danger of his world felt very far away. It didn't stay far away for long. That was the nature of the life he led, Claire was learning. Peace was always temporary, always borrowed against some future reckoning. But she found in those weeks that she didn't regret her choice, even as she began to understand its full cost. There were guards now, discreetly stationed near her apartment building, men she'd learned to nod to without acknowledging their purpose aloud.
There were nights Damien left her bed at 2 a.m.
for calls he wouldn't explain, returning hours later with his jaw tight and new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. There were meetings, business, he called them, in a tone that told her not to ask further, that sometimes kept him away for days, during which she'd catch glimpses on the news of unnamed incidents in warehouse districts and would lie awake wondering, with a fear she was slowly, painfully learning to carry, whether his name was somehow tangled in the story beneath the headline. "Does it get easier?" she asked him once, after one such absence, tracing the new tension in his shoulders as he lay beside her, exhausted in a way sleep didn't seem to touch. "No," he admitted honestly. "You learn to carry it. That is different from it becoming lighter." "And Sofia? How do you protect her from all of it, forever?" Damien was quiet for a long moment. "I have been trying to find a way out," he said finally. "Not entirely out. Some debts, some obligations, they do not simply vanish because a man wishes them to, but a smaller life, a safer one. I have been in negotiations for over a year, restructuring, divesting from the more dangerous arrangements in favour of the legitimate business alone." He turned to face her in the dark. "I want this, Claire. Not just for Sofia, for you. For the family I am starting to believe I might actually be allowed to have." Claire pressed her palm flat against his chest, over the steady, stubborn beat of his heart. "Then let's build toward that," she whispered. "Together." He kissed her palm, then her wrist, then the inside of her elbow, slow and reverent, like a man memorizing something he was terrified to lose. "Together," he agreed, the word sounding in his low, accented voice like the most dangerous and most beautiful promise he had ever made. The invitation arrived on thick cream cardstock embossed with gold lettering. The Marchetti Family Foundation Winter Gala, black tie, the Plaza Hotel. "You want me there," Claire said, turning the card over in her hands, feeling its unusual weight. "In a room full of people who know exactly who and what you are." "I want you there," Damien said, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror while Claire watched from the bed, "because I am tired of hiding the only good thing that has happened to me in years. And because," he added, turning to face her, his expression serious, "it is time certain people understood that you are protected, that you belong to this family now, in every sense that matters. There is safety in that clarity, Claire, more safety than in secrecy." She understood, reading between the careful lines of his explanation, that this gala was not merely a party, it was a declaration, a message sent to the shifting, watchful world of New York's underworld that Claire Bennett was under Damien Marchetti's protection, and that any threat against her would be answered with the full weight of his power. The dress he'd had made for her, deep emerald silk, cut with a simplicity that made its expense somehow more obvious rather than less, fit as though it had been poured onto her body. When she walked out of the dressing room of his penthouse, Damien, already immaculate in a black tuxedo, went very still. "You are going to end me," he said quietly, "before dinner has even started." The gala itself was a study in contrasts that Claire found dizzying, extraordinary opulence layered over an undercurrent of danger she was only now learning to read. Beautiful women in couture gowns whose eyes tracked every movement in the room with predatory precision. Men who laughed warmly at each other's jokes, while their bodyguards stood at careful, measured distances, never more than a few feet from a clear sightline to the exits. Damien introduced her simply, to person after person. "This is Claire. No explanation, no qualifier, though the way he said it, his hand resting possessively at the small of her back, communicated everything the words did not. Some of the men who greeted her did so with genuine warmth. A woman named Contessa Rossi, elegant and sharp-eyed, kissed both Claire's cheeks and murmured, "Finally, someone worthy of him." I was starting to think Damien intended to grieve forever. Others were colder. A tall, silver-haired man named Marco Genovese shook Claire's hand with a grip too firm to be friendly, his eyes lingering on her with an assessment that felt less like admiration and more like calculation. "The kindergarten teacher," he said, in a tone that made the profession sound like an insult. "How refreshingly ordinary, Damien. I would have expected someone more suited to your position." "Claire's position," Damien said, his voice dropping into something with an edge Claire had only glimpsed once before, in a dark parking lot weeks ago, "is exactly where I want her. I would advise you to remember that, Marco." The two men held each other's gaze for a beat too long, something ancient and wordless passing between them, a warning given and, reluctantly, received. Marco smiled thinly, inclined his head, and moved away into the crowd. But Claire noticed Damien's hand tighten fractionally at her waist, and understood that whatever history existed between the two men was not resolved by a single icy exchange at a party. "Who is he?" Claire asked quietly, once they'd found a quiet corner near the enormous Christmas tree glittering with gold ornaments. "Head of the Genovese family," Damien said. "We have maintained an uneasy peace for years, a treaty of sorts inherited from our fathers. He does not approve of my restructuring. My movement toward legitimacy threatens the old order, the balance of power that has kept the peace between the 5 families since before either of us were born. Men like Marco believe that softness, however small, is an invitation for others to take what is not theirs." "Is he dangerous?" "Everyone in this room is dangerous, Claire," Damien said simply. "That is the nature of the world you have chosen. But Marco specifically, yes, more dangerous than most. He has wanted my territory since we were boys, and Isabella's death gave him hope, briefly, that grief might finally make me weak enough to take." Claire's chest went cold. "Did he—" "No," Damien said quickly, before she could finish the terrible question. "Isabella's death was not his doing, but he did not mourn it either, and that tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man he is." Later that night, on the dance floor beneath a chandelier the size of a small car, Damien held her close, his lips against her temple, and for a few suspended minutes the danger of the room around them faded into the periphery, leaving only the two of them, swaying slowly to a string quartet's rendition of a song Claire didn't recognize. "I love you," Damien murmured against her hair. "I have not said those words to anyone since Isabella. I did not think I would ever say them again." "I love you too," Claire whispered back, and meant it with a fullness that frightened her slightly, given everything she now understood about the man holding her. Even knowing everything, especially knowing everything. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his dark eyes luminous in the golden light. "Marry me," he said, so quietly it might have been meant only for himself. "Not tonight, not even soon, if you need time. But someday, Claire, I want you to be my wife. I want Sofia to have a mother again. I want a family that is not built on fear." Claire's breath caught, her heart racing with a joy so enormous it bordered on terror.
"Ask me again," she said, "when you've truly found a way out of all of this. When Sofia is safe, and I am safe, and this life doesn't come with guards at my door and unexplained absences at 2 in the morning. Ask me then, and I will say yes before you've even finished the sentence." Damien's smile, rare, genuine, devastating, spread slowly across his face.
"Then I have all the motivation in the world," he said, "to finish what I have started." Neither of them noticed, across the crowded ballroom, Marco Genovese watching them from beneath the glittering chandelier, his expression unreadable, his phone already lifting discreetly to his ear. January brought a bitter cold that seemed to seep into everything, and with it a subtle shift in the atmosphere around Damien that Claire couldn't quite name but felt in her bones, the way animals sense a coming storm before the sky changes colour. He was more careful now, more guards, though he insisted it was routine winter precaution, more late nights, more terse phone calls taken behind closed doors, his voice dropping into a register Claire had learned meant business she wasn't meant to overhear. He held her tighter when they were together, as if compensating for some threat he refused to name. And once, waking from a nightmare she couldn't get him to describe, she found him standing at the window of his bedroom at 4 in the morning, watching the street below with the stillness of a man keeping vigil. "Talk to me," she said, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she joined him at the window. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." "Marco Genovese has grown bold," Damien said finally, his jaw tight in the moonlight. "2 of my shipments were intercepted last week, not by police, by his men, dressed to look like a rival crew from Brooklyn. A message, meant to look like it came from someone else, testing whether I would retaliate against the wrong target." "Did you?" "No." "I am not a fool, whatever else I may be." He exhaled slowly. "But it tells me he is preparing for something larger. My movement toward legitimate business, my public relationship with you, my open declaration that I intend to soften, all of it reads to men like Marco as weakness, and weakness in this world is an invitation." Claire's stomach tightened with fear that had become, over the months, a familiar, unwelcome companion. "What does that mean for us? For Sofia?" "It means I will not let anything happen to either of you," Damien said, turning to face her fully, his hands framing her face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the grim set of his jaw. "It means I have already increased security at the school, discreetly, without alarming anyone. It means I am accelerating certain negotiations that I had hoped to handle more slowly, more carefully." "Negotiations meaning what, exactly?" Damien hesitated, and in that hesitation Claire felt the familiar chill of old habits, the instinct to protect her through omission rather than honesty. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't do that again. We promised each other, remember? Eyes open." He nodded slowly, something in him yielding. "There is a meeting of the 5 families in 3 weeks, a summit of sorts, that occurs every several years to redistribute territory, resolve disputes, maintain the old balance. I intend to use it to formally announce my full transition to legitimate business, to relinquish certain territories, certain arrangements entirely, in exchange for guarantees of safety for myself and my family. It is a significant concession. It will make me appear weaker to some. But it is the only path I can see toward the life I want to build with you and Sofia." And Marco? Marco will see it as an opportunity, Damien admitted. He will likely attempt to claim whatever territory I relinquish, and possibly more besides. There is a real possibility, Claire, that this summit does not end peacefully. I want you to understand that before it happens. I want you to have the choice, clearly laid out, to step back from all of this if the danger becomes more than you are willing to carry. Claire thought of Sofia's drawing, 3 figures, joined hands, and of the way the girl had pressed Claire's palm into her father's in the flour-dusted kitchen, sealing something neither adult had dared to name aloud. She thought of every rainy afternoon, every 4-inch victory, every fragile word spoken after 2 years of silence. "I'm not stepping back," she said. "I told you that already, and I meant it. But I need you to promise me something in return. Anything. Promise me you'll let me help. Not with the parts I can't understand, the violence, the business I don't want details about, but with Sofia, with keeping our family together through whatever comes. Don't shut me out to protect me, Damien. I would rather stand beside you in danger than be safely kept in the dark." Damien studied her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful and heartbroken moving across his face all at once. "You are the bravest person I have ever known," he said finally. "Braver than any man I have commanded, any soldier I have trusted with my life. I do not deserve you, Claire Bennett. I have known that since the first rainy afternoon I watched you sit with my silent daughter and refused to give up on her." "You don't have to deserve me," Claire said softly, pressing her forehead against his. "You just have to keep choosing me, every day. That's all any of this ever is." Outside, the January wind rattled against the windows, and somewhere across the city, in rooms Claire would never see, men were already beginning to move pieces on a board she barely understood, preparing for a confrontation that would test everything the two of them had built in these fragile, precious months. Damien held her through what remained of the night, and if his grip was tighter than usual, if his eyes stayed open long after hers had closed, Claire chose not to notice, choosing instead to hold on to the warmth of him, the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, for as long as the world allowed her to. The summit was held at a private estate in Westchester, a sprawling stone mansion behind iron gates that Claire only saw from a distance. In photographs Damien reluctantly showed her afterward, because she had insisted, over his considerable objection, on being present, at least nearby, rather than waiting at home in ignorance while his fate was decided in a room she wasn't allowed to enter. "You cannot come inside," he'd told her firmly, the morning of the summit, dressed in a black suit so severe it looked almost like armour. "It is not a matter of trust, Claire. It is tradition. No families, no outsiders in the room where business is discussed. Breaking that rule would itself be seen as provocation." "Then I'll wait nearby," Claire said. "Not in the room, but close enough that if something goes wrong, I'm not 3 hours away wandering." He'd relented, eventually, arranging for her to wait at a small inn a mile from the estate, guarded discreetly by 2 of his most trusted men, with Sofia, who had stubbornly refused to be left with a nanny, clinging to Claire's hand with a silent, fierce insistence that had melted every objection, tucked safely beside her. The hours crawled. Claire tried to read to Sofia, tried to distract them both with a board game from the inn's small collection, but her mind kept drifting to that stone mansion behind iron gates, to Damien sitting across a table from men who might, even now, be deciding whether he lived or died. It was nearly evening when the first sign of trouble arrived. Not a call, but the sudden, sharp change in posture of the two guards stationed near the inn's door, their hands moving instinctively toward jackets that Claire now understood concealed weapons. "Stay here," one of them said, voice tight. "Do not leave this room." Claire gathered Sofia against her, heart hammering, straining to hear anything through the thin walls. Minutes passed like hours. Then her phone rang, Damien's name on the screen, and she answered with hands that shook. "Claire." His voice was rough, breathless, alive with an adrenaline she'd never heard in it before. "Are you and Sofia safe?" We're fine, Damien. What happened?" "Marco made his move," Damien said, and she could hear, beneath the words, the sounds of a car engine, of urgency. During the summit, he attempted to have men breach the estate perimeter while the meeting was underway. An assassination, timed to look like it came from the Colombo family, another false flag to shift the balance of blame. A pause, tight with fury. It failed. My men anticipated it, but there was violence, Claire. People are dead. I am not one of them, and I need you to hold on to that fact while I tell you the rest. Claire's knees nearly buckled with relief and horror in equal measure. What happens now? The other three families saw exactly what Marco attempted, Damien said. An attack during a sanctioned summit is the gravest violation of the old rules that exists. He has, in a single reckless move, united every other family against him. He exhaled, and she heard something that might have been disbelief. I am safer now than I have been in years, Claire. My proposal to transition to legitimate business was approved unanimously, in part because the other families now see Marco as the true threat to the old order, not me. He overreached, and in doing so, he handed me exactly what I have been trying to build for over a year. And Marco himself? The silence that followed told her everything the words didn't. He will not be troubling us again, Damien said finally, quiet and final, and Claire chose once more the mercy of not asking further. She and Sofia were brought back to the penthouse that night under heavy escort, and when Damien finally arrived past midnight, blood, not his own, she would learn later, though the sight of even a smear of it on his collar made her stomach clench, still marking the edge of his shirt beneath his coat, Claire didn't hesitate. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, holding on as if her grip alone could keep him tethered to this world. "You're alive," she whispered into his chest. "You're alive, and it's over." "It is over," Damien confirmed, his own arms coming around her with a desperate strength, his face buried in her hair. "The war I inherited, the one that took Isabella from me, the one I have spent 2 years trying to end. It is finally, truly over, Claire. I am free." Sofia, roused by their voices, appeared in the doorway in her pyjamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. And when she saw her father, alive, whole, holding the woman who had taught her to speak again, she crossed the room without hesitation and wrapped her small arms around both their legs, holding on with the same fierce, silent insistence she'd shown all day. "Papa," she said, her 4th sentence in 2 years, delivered with a clarity that made both adults freeze. "Are we safe now?" Damien knelt immediately, gathering his daughter into his arms, tears finally openly falling down his face. Yes, Piccola, he said, his voice breaking with the enormity of the promise. We are safe now. All three of us. I promise you, we are safe. The weeks following the summit felt like emerging from a long, dark tunnel into sudden, disorienting daylight. Damien began the slow, methodical work of dismantling the criminal architecture his family had built over 3 generations, divesting from illegal shipping routes, severing ties with associates who dealt in the darker corners of the business, restructuring Marchetti Holdings into something that could, for the first time in its history, survive an audit. It wasn't instant. It wasn't clean. There were setbacks. An old associate who threatened to go to federal investigators unless paid an exorbitant sum for his silence, quietly, expensively handled. A shipment of legitimate goods that turned out to have illicit cargo hidden inside, forcing Damien to burn bridges with partners he'd known his entire life. But Claire watched, week by week, as the tension around his eyes began slowly to ease. As the late-night calls grew less frequent, as he started sleeping through the night for the first time since she'd known him. Sofia's recovery accelerated in parallel, as if the girl's healing had been tethered all along to the resolution of the danger surrounding her family, some instinctive childhood wisdom recognizing safety before her conscious mind could name it. By February, she was speaking in full sentences at home, though still selectively quiet at school, a caution Claire recognized and respected, understanding that trust, once broken as catastrophically as Sofia's had been, rebuilds itself in its own careful time. "I want to make cookies," Sofia announced one Saturday afternoon, standing in the kitchen doorway with the casual confidence of a child who had simply decided, at some internal threshold, that speaking was worth the risk again. Damien, seated at the counter reviewing documents, went utterly still, his pen frozen mid-signature, before setting it down with exaggerated calm. "What kind of cookies, Piccola?" "Chocolate chip. Claire's kind, not the fancy kind from the bakery." Claire, who had been half listening from the pantry, emerged with flour already in hand, biting back tears, because Sofia's kind of ordinary, chocolate chip cookies, a preference stated plainly, a small domestic joy claimed without hesitation, was the most extraordinary thing Claire had witnessed in her 6 years of teaching. They baked together, flour dusting the marble counters again, the same counters where Sofia had first laughed months ago, and when the cookies came out of the oven slightly misshapen and perfect, Sofia climbed onto a stool between the 2 adults and, without prompting, without hesitation, said the words that would live in Claire's memory forever. "Can Claire be my mum now? Not instead of my real mum, just also." Damien's composure, so carefully maintained through summits and betrayals and the slow dismantling of an empire, finally broke entirely. He turned away for a moment, one hand pressed to his mouth, his shoulders shaking silently, and when he turned back, his face was wet and unguarded in a way Claire had only glimpsed twice before. "Sofia," Claire said gently, kneeling to meet the girl's eyes, her own vision blurred with tears. "I would be so honoured to be your also mum, if that's what you want." Sofia nodded solemnly, then, as if the enormity of the conversation required immediate lightning, grabbed a cookie and declared, around a mouthful of chocolate chips, "This one's my favourite." And the moment dissolved into laughter, real and full and utterly unguarded, filling the kitchen the way sunlight fills a room that has been dark for a very long time. That night, after Sofia had fallen asleep clutching a stuffed fox Claire had given her months ago, The same fox from the storybook, Claire realized with a jolt, from that very first rainy afternoon. Damien found Claire on the terrace, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, staring out at the glittering expanse of the city below. "She asked you to be her mother," he said quietly, joining her at the railing. "She did. I have wanted to ask you the same question in a different form for months now," Damien said, and Claire turned to find him already lowering himself to one knee, a small velvet box appearing from his coat pocket with the same quiet precision he brought to everything he did. "I told you at the gala I would ask again, once I had truly found a way out of the danger, once you and Sofia were safe. I believe now that I have kept that promise." Claire's breath caught, her hands flying to her mouth. "Claire Bennett," Damien said, his voice steady despite the emotion trembling beneath it. "You walked into my daughter's life on a rainy afternoon and gave her back her voice. You walked into my life not long after and gave me back a future I thought had died with my wife. I am not a simple man. I carry a complicated history, and even now, having stepped back from the darkest parts of it, I am not without enemies, without risk, without the weight of everything I have done to survive. But I love you with everything that remains good in me, and I want to spend whatever years I have left proving myself worthy of that love. Every single day. Will you marry me?" Claire looked down at this man, dangerous and gentle, ruthless and devoted, a king of a fading underworld who had chosen, for her and for his daughter, to lay down his crown, and felt the answer rise in her chest with a certainty that erased every fear that had ever shadowed it. "Yes," she said, pulling him up into her arms before he'd even finished sliding the ring onto her trembling finger. "Yes, Damien, 1,000 times, yes." Inside, unseen by either of them, Sofia stood in the doorway to the terrace in her pyjamas, having woken and wandered out in search of water, watching the scene unfold with wide, delighted eyes, before padding silently back to bed with a small, satisfied smile, the smile of a child who had, after 2 long years of silence, finally gotten exactly what she'd been too afraid to ask for. They married in June in a small stone chapel upstate that Damien's mother had once attended as a girl, long before the Marchetti name carried the weight it did now. Claire had insisted on small, no ballroom, no 500 guests, no gilded excess that would have turned the day into another performance of power rather than a genuine celebration of love. Damien had agreed to every request without argument, a small, private smile playing at his lips each time, as though he found her insistence on modesty as endearing as she found his instinct toward extravagance. In the end, they compromised. A small chapel, 60 guests, and afterward a reception at the penthouse that Damien had quietly transformed into something warm and golden rather than cold and museum-like, string lights woven through the terrace railings, candles flickering in every window. Sofia, 7 years old now, served as flower girl, scattering white rose petals down the aisle with the solemn concentration of a child undertaking a sacred duty. She had, in the months since the proposal, blossomed into a chatty, curious, occasionally mischievous little girl who bore almost no resemblance to the silent, watchful child Claire had first knelt beside in a kindergarten reading corner. She still had quiet days, still carried the particular gravity of a child who had witnessed something no child should witness, but the silence had loosened its grip, degree by degree, the way Claire had always believed it would, given enough safety and enough time. Claire's father walked her down the aisle, tears already streaming despite his gruff football coach exterior. And when she reached the altar, Damien's face, that composed, controlled face that had once terrified restaurant staff and silenced rival mafia bosses, dissolved into something so openly, helplessly emotional that Claire nearly lost her own composure before she'd even said a word.
"You look," he whispered as she reached him, "like every good thing I did not believe I was allowed to have."
The ceremony was brief and traditional, and when the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, Damien kissed her with a tenderness that drew soft laughter and applause from the small, gathered crowd, Contessa Rossi dabbing at her eyes in the second row, Priya sobbing openly beside Claire's mother, even the two quiet, ever-present security men allowing themselves small, genuine smiles from their positions near the chapel doors. At the reception, beneath the string lights on the terrace, Damien rose to give a toast that surprised everyone, including Claire, with its rawness. "I do not know how to speak the way other men speak at these gatherings," he began, his glass raised, his voice steady despite the vulnerability plain on his face. "I have spent much of my life speaking in a different language, the language of power, of consequence, of things left carefully unsaid. But tonight I want to say plainly what I have felt every day since a rainy afternoon 18 months ago, when I watched a young teacher sit patiently with my silent daughter and refuse, absolutely, to give up on her." He turned to look at Claire, his dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "I built an empire out of fear," he continued, "because that is what I was taught power required. I inherited a war that took my first wife from me, that stole 2 years of my daughter's voice, that nearly cost me everything I have ever loved. I believed for a long time that I was not a man capable of gentleness, that gentleness itself was a weakness the world would exploit the moment I allowed it to show. Claire Bennett, Claire Marchetti now, taught me otherwise. She taught my daughter to speak again with nothing but patience and warmth. She taught me that love is not a weakness to be hidden, but the only true source of strength I have ever known. I do not deserve the family standing before me tonight, but I intend to spend every remaining day of my life trying to." He raised his glass higher. "To Claire, to Sofia, to the family I did not believe I would be allowed to have, and to the woman who gave it to me anyway." The toast dissolved into tears and applause, and Sofia, sitting between her father's chair and her new mother's in a small white dress with rose petals still caught in her dark curls, tugged at Claire's sleeve with the particular urgency of a child with something important to say. "Mum," she said, the word landing in Claire's chest with the force of a small, perfect miracle. "Can I have cake now?" Claire laughed through her tears, gathering the girl into her lap. "Yes, baby, you can have all the cake you want." Later that night, after the guests had gone and Sofia had finally fallen asleep in her own bed down the hall, Damien found Claire on the same terrace where he'd proposed, still in her wedding dress, gazing out at the glittering city that had once terrified her and now felt simply like home. "Mrs. Marchetti," he murmured, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his lips finding the curve of her neck. "Mr. Marchetti," she replied, leaning back into his warmth, feeling for the first time in her life the particular piece of a story that had found its true ending. Not the ending of a fairy tale, unmarked by danger or difficulty, but the harder one, more honest ending of two damaged people who had chosen each other anyway, eyes wide open, and built something real from the wreckage of what came before. "I love you," Damien said softly, "more than I have words to properly express in any language." "Show me then," Claire whispered, turning in his arms to face him. "We have the rest of our lives." Marriage did not erase the world Damien had come from, and Claire had known, going in with eyes fully open, that some shadows would linger even after the darkest threats had been resolved.
The FBI, it turned out, did not simply close its files because a man decided to go legitimate. It began with a subpoena, polite, formal, delivered by a man in an ill-fitting suit who looked profoundly uncomfortable standing in the marble lobby of Damien's building. Special Agent Renata Cole of the Organised Crime Task Force wanted to speak with Damien Marchetti regarding matters pertaining to an ongoing federal investigation into racketeering activities associated with the Marchetti family enterprise spanning multiple decades. Claire, 7 months into marriage and newly, quietly pregnant, a secret she and Damien had been savouring alone for barely 2 weeks, felt the old fear resurface with brutal, familiar force.
"They cannot charge me with anything they can prove," Damien said calmly, though Claire noticed his hand trembled slightly as he set down the subpoena on the kitchen counter. "I have spent the last year and a half ensuring precisely that. Every account, every transaction, restructured, legitimized, documented. But an investigation of this scope, it will take months, possibly years, and it will not be pleasant, regardless of the outcome. What does it mean for us, for Sofia?" "It means lawyers," Damien said grimly. "It means depositions and reporters camped outside our building, and the possibility, however remote I believe it to be, that some past action, buried deep enough that even I have nearly forgotten it, resurfaces in a way I cannot control." The months that followed tested them in ways neither had anticipated. Claire's pregnancy, which should have been a season of pure joy, unfolded instead against a backdrop of legal meetings and careful public statements, of paparazzi occasionally lurking near the kindergarten where she still, stubbornly, insisted on teaching part-time, despite Damien's gentle protests about safety. "I am not going to disappear into a gilded cage," she told him firmly, more than once, "just because the world outside got complicated again. Sofia needs to see that her mother still shows up for the things that matter, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Damien, to his credit, learned to stop arguing and started instead to simply increase security around the school, with such discretion that most parents never noticed the additional presence, and Mrs. Alvarez, who had come to genuinely adore both Claire and the family she'd married into, quietly ensured that any press inquiries about the Mafia teacher were rebuffed with the particular fury of a woman who had watched Sofia's transformation firsthand and would not have it exploited by tabloid curiosity. The investigation dragged through the fall and into winter, a slow grind of subpoenaed documents and closed-door interviews, during which Damien's newly clean records, every transaction traceable, every partnership above board, proved, gradually, exactly what he had promised Claire they would prove. The final blow to the investigation came, unexpectedly, from an old ally turned witness, one of Marco Genovese's surviving lieutenants seeking a plea deal, who testified in detail about Marco's decades of racketeering, his role in orchestrating the failed summit assassination, and, devastatingly, his connection to the hit that had killed Isabella Marchetti 2 years prior. a detail Damien had never confirmed to Claire directly, though she had long suspected it, and which finally, painfully, brought closure to a wound that had never fully healed. "They are recommending the investigation into my current business activities be closed," Damien told her one evening in December, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, a folder of legal documents spread between them, his voice carrying a disbelief that had not yet fully processed relief. "Insufficient evidence of any wrongdoing in the past 18 months. My legitimate business stands entirely on its own."
Claire, 7 months pregnant now, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, felt tears spill freely down her cheeks. "It's really over," she said. "All of it. The old life. It's finally, truly over." "It is over," Damien confirmed, moving around the table to kneel beside her chair, his hand joining hers over the curve of their unborn child. "I built an empire out of fear, and I nearly lost everything to the darkness that empire required. But I am building something new now, Claire. With you, with Sofia, with this child who will never have to know the world I came from, except as a story, safely distant, from which their parents emerged whole." Sofia, now 8, appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, drawn by voices she recognized as important, even if she couldn't fully pass the legal language.
"Is it good news?" she asked, settling naturally between her parents, one hand finding Claire's belly with the easy affection of a child utterly secure in her family's love. "The best news, Piccola," Damien said, gathering both his daughter and his wife into his arms. "We are safe, all of us, truly, finally safe." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall over Manhattan, soft and quiet, blanketing the city in a white hush that felt, for the first time in longer than Claire could remember, entirely peaceful. Peace, Claire was learning, was not the same as the absence of all difficulty. Even with the investigation closed, even with Marco Genovese's organization scattered and absorbed by more stable rivals, even with Damien's business finally fully legitimate, there were still moments when the past reached forward with grasping, unwelcome hands. It happened in March, 3 weeks before Claire's due date, when a woman appeared at the school during pickup. Not one of the regular parents, not anyone Claire recognized, dressed plainly, but with an intensity in her dark eyes that immediately set Claire on edge. "Are you Claire Marchetti?" the woman asked, her accent thick, unmistakably Sicilian. "Can I help you?" Claire replied carefully, one hand instinctively moving to shield the swell of her belly, the other reaching for Sofia's shoulder, guiding the girl slightly behind her. "My name is Rosaria Conti," the woman said. "My brother worked for Marco Genovese. He is dead now, because of your husband's business, because of the war Damien Marchetti has spent his whole life perpetuating, even as he pretends to have become a changed man." Claire's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady, aware of Sofia's presence, aware of other parents nearby. "I'm very sorry for your loss, but I don't think this is the place." "I do not want to hurt you," Rosaria interrupted, though something in her rigid posture suggested she'd considered it. "I only want you to know what kind of man you have married. The gentle mask he wears for you, it is not the truth of him. It has never been the truth of him." "I know exactly what kind of man I married," Claire said, surprising herself with the calm certainty in her own voice. "I know his history. I know what he's done and what he's trying to become. I'm sorry for whatever pain your family has suffered, truly. But threatening me outside my student's school will not bring your brother back, and it will not change the choice I've made with my eyes wide open."
Something in Rosaria's expression shifted, not quite softening, but recalibrating, as if she'd expected fear or ignorance and found instead a clear-eyed resolve she hadn't anticipated. "You are either very brave," Rosaria said finally, "or very foolish." "Perhaps both," Claire replied. "But I'd ask you to leave now, please, before I call the police, or before my husband's security notices you've approached me here." Rosaria left without further incident, but the encounter shook Claire deeply enough that she called Damien immediately, her hands trembling as she relayed the conversation, Sofia clutching her hand tightly, having absorbed more of the tension than Claire would have liked. Damien arrived within 20 minutes, his face carved from stone, and immediately dispatched 2 of his men to ensure Rosaria Conti posed no further threat, a phrase that Claire understood by now could mean anything from a stern warning to something far more permanent, and which she chose, once again, not to interrogate too closely. "I am sorry," he said that night, holding Claire close as she processed the lingering adrenaline of the encounter. "I believed the old conflicts had been fully resolved. I did not anticipate grief manifesting in someone connected to Marco's organization, reaching toward you directly." "I handled it," Claire said, though her voice still carried a slight tremor. "I'm not made of glass, Damien. I knew what I was choosing when I married you. I knew the ghosts of your old life might occasionally reach for me, even now. That does not mean I must accept it calmly," Damien said, his voice hard. "I will not have you or our children living forever in the shadow of grudges I inherited. I have made mistakes, Claire. Men are dead because of choices I made or that were made in my family's name before I was even born. I do not excuse that. But I will not allow it to reach into the life we are building, not while I have breath left in my body to prevent it." Claire pressed her palm to his jaw, turning his face toward her. "I know," she said softly. "I've never doubted that. But Damien, we cannot control every ghost from your past. What we can control is how we respond. With fear, or with the same clear-eyed courage that got us here in the first place." He kissed her then, slow and grateful, his hand finding the curve of her belly where their child waited, oblivious to the complicated inheritance of love and danger they would eventually grow to understand. "3 weeks," Damien murmured against her forehead. "3 weeks until we meet this child. And I find myself terrified and overjoyed in equal measure, the way I have felt about every important thing since the day I met you." "Terrified and overjoyed," Claire repeated, smiling despite the day's earlier fear. "I think that might just be what love feels like, when it's real." Their son arrived on a rain-soaked April night, 3 days past his due date, in a labour that stretched nearly 14 hours and left Claire simultaneously more exhausted and more triumphant than she had ever felt in her life. Damien never left her side, his composed exterior cracking entirely somewhere around hour 10, when Claire's grip on his hand grew fierce enough to leave marks, and he'd murmured a string of Italian that Claire, in her pain-fogged haze, understood instinctively as prayer rather than curse. A man who had faced down rival Mafia bosses without flinching, undone entirely by the sight of his wife in pain he could not fix with money or power or fear. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he told her, over and over, pressing kisses to her damp forehead between contractions. "Stronger than any man in my organization, stronger than my father ever was. I love you, Claire, I love you so much.
When their son finally arrived, small, furious, wailing, with the particular outrage of a creature newly evicted from warmth and safety into cold, bright existence, Damien wept openly, unashamed, holding the tiny bundle against his chest with hands that had once, in another life, held very different kinds of weight.
"Marco," Claire said weakly, exhausted but radiant, watching her husband hold their son. "I want to name him Marco. Not for the man who tried to kill you, for the reclaiming of it. So the name means something new in our family, something good, instead of something dangerous." Damien looked up at her, startled, something complicated moving across his face before settling into understanding. "Marco Marchetti," he said slowly, testing the name against the small, wrinkled face of his sleeping son.
A new meaning, built from old wreckage. I think Isabella would have liked that. She always believed in reclaiming things others had ruined.
Sofia, 9 years old now, met her baby brother the following morning, tiptoeing into the hospital room with the particular solemnity of an older sibling approaching a sacred responsibility. She studied the small, red-faced infant in Claire's arms for a long moment before declaring, with the confident authority of a girl who had, in the past 3 years, learned that her voice mattered and deserved to be used. "He looks like he's going to be trouble," Sofia announced. "I like him already." The family that gathered around that hospital bed in the following days looked nothing like the fractured, grief-stricken group Claire had first encountered in a rain-streaked kindergarten hallway 3 years earlier.
Contessa Rossi arrived with flowers and unsolicited advice about infant sleep schedules. Claire's parents flew in from Ohio, her mother immediately taking over the kitchen at the penthouse with the brisk efficiency of a woman determined to feed everyone within reach. Priya arrived with a stuffed elephant nearly as large as the infant himself, declaring it objectively too big, but also objectively perfect. Even Damien's men, the quiet, ever-present security presence that had once unsettled Claire and now felt as familiar as furniture, sent gifts, awkwardly wrapped, delivered by the same driver who had once held umbrellas over her head on rainy nights, and now beamed with genuine paternal pride at the sight of the newest Marchetti. "We built something real," Damien murmured one evening, watching Claire nurse their son in the soft lamplight of the nursery. Sofia curled asleep on the rocking chair beside them, exhausted from the excitement of the day. "Something I did not believe. 3 years ago, I was capable of building. A family untainted by the things I inherited. Not untainted," Claire corrected gently. "Marked by it, maybe. Shaped by it, in some ways will always carry. But not defined by it, Damien. That's the difference. We didn't erase your past. We just refused to let it decide our future." He kissed the crown of her head, then leaned down to press a gentle kiss to their sleeping son's forehead, and finally crossed the room to do the same to Sofia, still curled in the rocking chair, dreaming whatever dreams belonged to a 9-year-old girl who had gotten back both her voice and her family, against every terrible odds that had once seemed insurmountable. "Thank you," he whispered, to all 3 of them, to the empty room, to the universe that had somehow, impossibly, allowed a widowed Mafia king and a gentle kindergarten teacher to build something whole from the wreckage of tragedy. "Thank you for choosing this, for choosing me." The kindergarten classroom at Maplewood looked exactly as it had 5 years earlier. Crayon-coloured walls, the smell of apple juice and glue sticks,
a reading corner where a new generation of small, uncertain children learned to trust the world again, one gentle afternoon at a time. Claire no longer taught there full-time. Motherhood and the occasional demands of the Marchetti Family Foundation, which she now co-chaired with Damien, had reshaped her schedule considerably. But she still substituted twice a week, unwilling to fully surrender the work that had first brought her into the orbit of the man who would become her husband. Sofia, now 11, had grown into a confident, occasionally fierce young girl, who spoke her mind with the same directness she'd first discovered over a plate of chocolate chip cookies years before. She'd taken up violin, much to Damien's quiet, overwhelming pride, and had recently informed her parents, with the same solemn authority she'd once used to declare her infant brother trouble, that she intended to become a child psychologist when she grew up. Because someone helped me find my voice again, and I want to do that for other kids too. Marco, now 5 and starting his own kindergarten year, not at Maplewood but at a similar school closer to the family's new home in Westchester, where Damien had finally fully relocated the family away from the shadows of his old territory, had inherited his mother's stubbornness and his father's watchful intensity in roughly equal measure, a combination that made him, according to his teachers, delightfully exhausting. Damien's business had grown into one of the city's most respected real estate development firms, Marchetti Holdings, now synonymous with luxury residential towers and community revitalization projects rather than whispered federal investigations. He still carried himself with the same controlled precision Claire had first noticed in a rainy hallway, still commanded rooms without raising his voice, but the coldness that had once shadowed his every interaction had softened, over the years, into something warmer. Not weaker, Claire had learned, but wiser. A man who had discovered that gentleness and strength were not opposites, but companions. They still faced occasional shadows from the past, a journalist digging for an exposé that ultimately found nothing but a legitimate business built on genuine reform. An old associate seeking favours that Damien firmly, politely declined. The rare, uncomfortable moment at a business function when someone's father or grandfather recognised the Marchetti name from an older, darker era. But these shadows had grown smaller with each passing year, easier to weather, no longer threatening to consume the life they'd built. On a warm September evening, 5 years to the week since that first rainy afternoon in the kindergarten reading corner, the family gathered on the terrace of their Westchester home, a sprawling but genuinely warm property, nothing like the cold museum elegance of the old Fifth Avenue penthouse, chosen specifically for its wraparound porch and enormous oak tree perfect for a swing that Damien had built himself, badly, with considerable assistance from a contractor he'd eventually admitted he needed. "Tell the story again," Marco demanded, climbing into his father's lap with the casual confidence of a child utterly secure in his place in the world. "The one about how you and Mum met." Damien exchanged a warm, private glance with Claire, who settled beside him with a glass of wine, watching the last of the summer light filter gold through the oak leaves. "Once upon a time," Damien began, his voice carrying the particular warmth reserved only for this story, told now dozens of times at the children's insistence, "there was a very sad little girl who had stopped speaking because something terrible had happened to her, and a very sad man who did not know how to help her, no matter how much money or power he had." "That's Sofia and you," Marco said, delighted, though he'd heard this 100 times. "That's right," Damien continued. "And one rainy afternoon, the sad little girl went to a new school and met a kind teacher who did not try to force her to speak, who simply sat beside her, patiently, every day, and waited for her to feel safe enough to use her voice again. "That's Mum," Marco confirmed, satisfied. "That's your mother," Damien agreed, reaching over to take Claire's hand, his eyes finding hers across the small distance between their chairs. And slowly, day by day, 4 inches at a time, the little girl began to heal, and the sad man began to hope again, for the first time in a very long time, that perhaps he was allowed a second chance at happiness after all. "And then you fell in love," Sofia said, from her position perched on the porch railing, 11 years old now, and rolling her eyes affectionately at a story she'd clearly graduated beyond needing, but still loved to hear. "And then we fell in love," Claire confirmed, smiling at her stepdaughter, at her son, at the man beside her who had once been the most feared name in New York's underworld, and was now simply her husband. A father who built swings badly and told bedtime stories well, who had traded an empire of fear for something infinitely more valuable. "Despite everything," Damien added quietly, for Claire alone, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm. "Despite every reason it should not have worked, despite the darkness I carried into that classroom, into your life, you chose me anyway." "I chose all of you," Claire corrected softly, watching Sofia hop down from the railing to chase fireflies across the darkening lawn, watching Marco squirm free of his father's lap to join her, their laughter rising bright and unguarded into the warm evening air. "Every single day, I'd choose this family again." It was Sofia who found the letter, tucked into an old box of Isabella's belongings that Damien had finally, after years of avoidance, decided to sort through, a task he'd been putting off since her death, unable to face the physical remnants of the life that had been stolen from him. "Papa," Sofia called from the study, her voice carrying a strange, careful quality that immediately drew both Damien and Claire from the kitchen. "There's a letter. It has my name on it." Damien went very still, staring at the cream envelope in his daughter's hands, Isabella's elegant, familiar handwriting spelling out "For Sofia, when she is ready," across the front. "Do you want to read it?" Claire asked gently, watching Sofia's face carefully, aware of the enormity of the moment, a message from beyond the grave, from a mother whose death this child had witnessed and never fully processed in words, only now, at 11, capable of holding. Sofia nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the envelope, and Damien pulled her close against his side as she began to read aloud, her voice wavering but determined. "My darling Sofia, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to tell you these things myself, and I am so sorry for that, sorrier than any words on this page could properly express. I am writing this while you sleep, my love, in your little bed with the Fox nightlight, because I have had a feeling lately that our family's life carries more danger than a mother should have to reconcile herself to, and I wanted to leave you something, just in case. I want you to know that none of what happens to our family is your fault. Whatever you witness, whatever you carry, please know that you are not responsible for the choices the adults around you have made, for the world your father was born into, and the price that world sometimes demands. I want you to know that your father loves you more than his own life. I have watched him hold you since the day you were born, like you were the only fragile, precious thing in an otherwise brutal world. And I know, whatever else happens, that love will never waver. And I want you to know this, my darling girl, above all else. If you ever find yourself unable to speak, unable to voice whatever pain you carry, please be patient with yourself. Grief takes whatever shape it needs to take. There is no wrong way to heal, only your own way, in your own time. Trust that the people who love you will wait for you, however long it takes, for as long as it takes. I love you more than the moon loves the tide, more than the roots love the rain. Be brave, my darling. Be gentle with yourself. And know that wherever I am watching you grow into someone extraordinary. All my love, always. Mama. By the time Sofia finished reading, all three of them were crying. Sofia clutching the letter to her chest, Damien with his arms wrapped tightly around his daughter, Claire watching with tears streaming freely down her own face, understanding, with a clarity that took her breath away, that Isabella had somehow, impossibly, predicted the exact healing that would eventually come, had given her permission for it years before it happened.
She knew, Sofia whispered. She knew I might stop talking. And she said it was okay. She said to be patient. She loved you so much, Damien said, his voice thick with an old grief, made new again, but softened now, somehow, by the gift his late wife had left behind. She would be so proud, Sofia, of everything you have overcome, of everything you have become. Sofia looked up at her father, then across at Claire, her young face carrying a wisdom that belonged to someone who had lived through more than most adults ever would. I think, she said slowly, Mama would like you, Claire. I think she'd be glad you were the one who helped me find my voice again. Claire crossed the room and knelt before her stepdaughter, taking both her hands, tears still falling freely. I think, Claire said softly, your mother gave you the gift of patience before she died, and I just happened to be the person lucky enough to be there when you were ready to use it. All the credit belongs to you, Sofia, and to her. I just showed up and waited. That night, after Sofia had finally fallen asleep with her mother's letter tucked safely beneath her pillow, Damien stood on the terrace with Claire, staring up at a sky scattered with more stars than usual, the city lights dimmed somehow by the particular clarity of the evening. I did not know that letter existed, he said quietly. In all these years, going through her things so carefully, I never found it until today. Maybe it wasn't time until today, Claire said, leaning into his side. Maybe some things wait for exactly the right moment to be found. Damien wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, and together they watched the stars in silence, carrying between them the particular ache and gratitude of a family built from loss and love in equal, inextricable measure. The invitation to speak at the National Association for the Education of Young Children conference arrived in Claire's inbox on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and she nearly deleted it, assuming it was spam, before realizing it was genuinely addressed to her, requesting she speak on a panel about trauma-informed approaches to selective mutism in early childhood education. They want me to talk about Sofia, Claire told Damien that evening, still slightly stunned.
Anonymized, of course, but they heard about her case through the school district. Apparently it became something of a quiet legend among early childhood specialists. A child who didn't speak for 2 years, who found her voice again through patient, unstructured support rather than clinical intervention alone. You should do it, Damien said immediately, no hesitation. You have spent years teaching, years helping children exactly like Sofia was.
This is your work, Claire, your calling. It deserves a wider audience. Would Sofia mind? Even anonymized, it feels like sharing something that belongs to her, not to me. They asked her that evening over dinner, and Sofia, now 12, increasingly articulate and startlingly wise for her age, considered the question with the particular seriousness she brought to decisions that mattered.
"I think," she said finally, "if it helps another kid feel less alone, or helps another teacher understand how to actually help instead of giving up, then yes, tell them my story. Just don't use my real name. I don't want people looking at me differently because of something that happened when I was 6.
Claire gave the speech in October, standing before a room of several hundred early childhood educators, describing, carefully, respectfully, with Sofia's explicit permission and gentle guidance about which details to include, the slow, patient work of sitting beside a traumatized child, letting silence be its own form of communication, measuring progress not in grand breakthroughs, but in small, cumulative victories. 4 inches, she told the room, her voice carrying across the auditorium with a conviction born from genuine experience.
That's how I measured the first sign of progress with a child who had stopped speaking after witnessing something no child should ever witness. 4 inches closer to the reading circle. It felt like nothing in the moment. It turned out to be everything. The speech was met with a standing ovation that left Claire blinking back tears, overwhelmed by a room full of educators who understood in their bones the particular sacred patience her work required. Afterward, in the lobby, a young teacher approached her, eyes red-rimmed with emotion. "I have a student like that," she said. "I've been feeling like I'm failing her because nothing I do seems to reach her. Your talk, it gave me permission to just keep showing up without needing a breakthrough on my own timeline." "That's all any of us can do," Claire told her, squeezing the young woman's hand. "Show up, stay patient, trust that healing happens on its own schedule, not ours." Damien had come to watch from the back of the auditorium, slipping in quietly after the introduction, unwilling to distract from Claire's moment, but unable to stay away entirely. When she found him afterward, his eyes were wet, his expression carrying the particular pride of a man watching his wife step fully into a purpose that had, years earlier, changed the entire trajectory of his family's life. "You were extraordinary," he said, pulling her into his arms in the quiet hallway outside the auditorium. "Watching you up there, describing what you did for Sofia, I fell in love with you all over again, Claire." As if I needed reminding of what an extraordinary woman I married. "I couldn't have done any of it without you trusting me with her," Claire said, "without you being brave enough to let a stranger into your daughter's healing, even when you didn't know if you could trust me with everything else that came alongside it." "The best decision I ever made," Damien said, "besides marrying you, was walking into that kindergarten classroom on a rainy afternoon and choosing to trust the woman kneeling on the floor with my silent daughter, rather than the 100 specialists who had already failed." That evening, driving home together while Sofia and Marco stayed with Claire's parents for the weekend, Claire found herself reflecting on the strange, improbable arc of her life. A kindergarten teacher from Ohio who had somehow ended up married to a former Mafia king, raising 2 children in a family built from tragedy and healing in equal measure, standing before rooms of educators to share the very lessons that had first drawn her into Damien and Sofia's orbit. "Do you ever think about how different everything could have gone?" she asked, watching the city lights blur past the car window. "If I'd never taken that teaching position,
If Sofia had been assigned a different classroom? If you'd given up on finding her a teacher who could reach her? Every day, Damien admitted. I think about how close I came to losing hope entirely before you arrived. How close Sofia came to spending her whole childhood locked inside a silence none of us knew how to unlock.
I do not believe in fate, Claire. I have seen too much of the world's randomness and cruelty to believe some grand design orchestrated our meeting. But I believe, absolutely, that I am the luckiest man alive that our paths happened to cross when they did. Claire reached across the console and took his hand, threading their fingers together in the comfortable, practiced way of 5 years of marriage. Lucky, she agreed, and brave enough, both of us, to choose each other, despite every reason it shouldn't have worked. On the 7th anniversary of that first rainy afternoon in the Maplewood Kindergarten reading corner, the Marchetti family gathered at the same small chapel upstate where Claire and Damien had married, not for another wedding, but for Sofia's confirmation, a milestone the 12-year-old girl had specifically requested take place in the chapel that held, for her, the memory of watching her father and her also mother commit themselves to each other and to her. The chapel looked exactly as it had years before, the same worn stone, the same stained glass casting fractured rainbow light across the pews, and Claire, watching Sofia stand at the altar in a simple white dress, felt the particular vertigo of time collapsing in on itself. The silent 6-year-old she'd first knelt beside, now a poised, articulate young woman on the cusp of adolescence, radiant with a confidence that had been unimaginable in those first difficult months. Marco, 6 now himself, fidgeted in the pew beside Claire, more interested in the stained glass patterns dancing across his hands than in the ceremony itself. And Damien, seated on Claire's other side, kept one arm around his wife and one hand resting on his son's small shoulder, anchoring both halves of his family in the sacred quiet of the moment. Afterward, at a small reception in the same garden where their wedding celebration had spilled into evening years before, Claire found a quiet moment to stand alone at the edge of the gathering, watching her family, her husband laughing with Contessa Rossi over some story from decades past, her daughter chasing her little brother across the lawn with the fierce, protective affection of an older sibling, her son shrieking with delighted laughter as Sofia caught him and swung him in a wide circle. "Penny for your thoughts," Damien said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of wine, handing her one as he followed her gaze toward their children. "I was just thinking," Claire said, "about how impossible this would have seemed 7 years ago. A silent little girl who wouldn't speak, a father drowning in grief and danger in equal measure, a kindergarten teacher who had no idea, walking into that classroom, that she was about to fall in love with a Mafia king, and somehow, against every reasonable odd, build a genuinely happy family with him." "Impossible," Damien agreed, wrapping his arm around her waist. "And yet, here we are." "Here we are," Claire echoed, leaning into him, watching the golden evening light settle over the garden, over her children's laughter, over the particular, hard-won peace of a family that had been forged not despite darkness, but through it, choosing love and patience and honesty at every single crossroads where fear or silence might have won instead. "Do you regret any of it?" Damien asked quietly, a question he'd asked variations of many times over the years, though Claire understood by now it carried less anxiety each time he asked it. "The danger you walked into,
knowing what I was. The risk I asked you to carry, simply by loving me. Claire turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers, the same hands that had once shaken hers formally in a rainy hallway, that had built a poorly constructed but deeply loved tree swing, that had held 2 newborn children with a tenderness that belied everything the world once feared about him. "Not for one single second," she said, with the complete, unwavering certainty of 7 years of chosen love. "I chose you knowing exactly who you were, Damien Marchetti. The king who built an empire out of fear, and the man who tore it down for the chance at something real. I would choose you again every single time, in every single version of this story." Damien pulled her close, pressing a slow, grateful kiss to her lips, there in the golden light of the garden, where their story had, in so many ways, truly begun. "I love you," he murmured against her mouth, "more today than the day I married you, more than I believed it was possible to love anyone after everything I had lost." "I love you too," Claire whispered back, "every version of you." The dangerous one I first glimpsed in a rainy hallway, and the gentle one who built a swing for our son. The Mafia king, and the man who chose every single day since to be something better. Across the garden, Sofia caught her parents' embrace out of the corner of her eye and smiled, a real, unguarded, radiant smile, the smile of a girl who had gotten back her voice, and alongside it, an entire family she'd once feared she would never fully have. She scooped Marco up onto her hip, despite his squirming protests, and carried him toward their parents, calling out into the warm evening air with the particular joyful confidence of a girl who had learned, against every terrible odd, that speaking up for what mattered was always, always worth the risk. "Mum, Dad, can we get ice cream on the way home?" Claire laughed, pulling back from Damien's embrace to gather both her children close, her husband's arm still warm around her shoulders, the whole complicated, hard-won, beautiful family standing together in the golden evening light. "Yes," she said, looking around at all of them, at the man who had once ruled New York's underworld and now simply ruled her heart, at the daughter who had taught them both what patient love could accomplish, at the son who existed only because 2 broken people had dared to choose each other anyway. "Ice cream sounds perfect. Let's go home." And they did, together, whole, safe, and entirely, unshakably certain of the love that had carried them against every impossible odd from a rainy kindergarten afternoon to this golden garden evening, and would carry them, Claire knew with complete certainty, through whatever remained of the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary life still waiting for them ahead.